been used as manipulation.
Correct.
Right? My pastor teaches it this way. We've watched too much WWE in America. And so we think that submission is strictly a chokehold.
Yeah.
And submission can be a nasty word.
Yep.
It's kind of like that, what's that D word? Discipline? It's just like, we don't like these words, right?
Yeah.
But these words are actually good words. Let me try to redeem that word for some people.
A pastor turned tech leader and a millennial churchgoer explore the intersection of technology, culture, and faith, equipping you with innovative strategies to support you as you live out your calling, lead your churches with confidence, and step into the future together. This is the Give It Up Podcast. In this episode, as a preface and as a trigger warning to people, I'm going to be wearing the hat of a jaded churchgoer, someone who's maybe left the church, someone who's maybe deconstructing. We're going to be talking about questions that people are asking, but they might not be asking out loud, and they're certainly not asking with a hot mic.
Wow, so a little bit of church hurt conversation.
A little bit of that, yes. And I'm not saying I'm this person. I'm just saying I'm acting as the person in this conversation.
Understood.
Okay? Let the games begin. I thought that was like the best way to intro this.
Sorry, if you're listening to this and you have church hurt, your life's not a game. We love you. God loves you, more importantly.
Amen. That's a great start. Okay, so there's a lot of questions that people have about what's going on in some, mega churches, bigger churches that have a lot of money. And the first question I want to talk about, first topic I want to talk about is, what is the deal with green rooms for pastors? And what scripture are we pointing to when we've created these segregated spaces for pastors to be in?
Sure. And, the purpose of this podcast is to, really bridge the gap between technology, innovation, culture, and the church, right? And a lot of our listeners are pastors, senior church leaders, executive pastors.
Yep.
And so hopefully this conversation can maybe add color or texture to things that people in our respective churches are thinking or are conversating about in small groups and maybe behind the scenes and things like that, and maybe not directly in the lobbies of our church. And I've heard this comment before of confusion around the purpose of a green room and things like that. Ultimately, where I see a green room valuable is obviously for the preacher or the pastor that is bringing the message that day to be able to focus and to be able to prepare accordingly. One of the most important things of that worship experience is to be able to articulate, communicate the gospel message in a way that can be heard and understood by the people in those seats. Because the most important thing a church can do is be a church. And one of the functions of a pastor outside of shepherd is actually herald. And so for them to have a space and place where they can focus, I've also seen a green room leveraged really well for hosting guests that are coming in town, where there might need to be a separate space for deeper connection, conversation. I've seen a green room used for deep pastoral care, right? Being able to have a deeper level conversation around maybe an offense, or maybe it's somebody that was prominent on team that wanted a one-on-one conversation with a pastor or a leader. I've seen a green room leverage for these purposes. I think where people get confused is when they never see the pastor. Because the pastor, while they're a herald, is also a shepherd. And so a shepherd is meant to be with the sheep. And so that's just something that we've made very, very clear in every single one of our campuses. In the church that I serve at as executive pastor, and our lead pastors do this brilliantly, is that we are not green room pastors. We are in the lobby, in people's world type pastors. We want to make sure that we are shepherding people, that we are, one of the best times to connect with people in your church is 15 minutes before and 15 minutes after. It's the best time. And so that is not the time, and I get it, because I've had the privilege to speak occasionally at our church, and you get an adrenaline rush after you speak on platform for 30, 40 minutes. And it can be exhausting, especially if you're doing 2-3 services in seasons. We've done even 4 services at our church. It's exhausting. But build in margin so you can connect for another 15 more minutes, and then maybe you can relieve yourself.
Yeah.
But that 15 minutes is so important. I would say that the confusion lies where the pastor may be absent.
Yeah, and that was actually the next question I was going to ask is, if a pastor is a shepherd, why are you just letting your sheep run around and you don't even know where they are?
Sure.
So you're not leaving one for the night, or any of that. You don't know where any of them are if you are entering and exiting before even one conversation can happen.
Right.
And if people see someone in a pastoral position, they're going to think, after what the church talks about is submitting to authority, right? Well, how do you know what authority to submit to if you don't get to talk to anyone at all? I want to talk about submitting to authority next.
Yeah.
That whole concept, because there's definitely a lot of people who've been burned by people in the church who have abused said spiritual authority.
Yeah, because it's been used as manipulation.
Correct.
Right. Again, a lot of these things are actually not for the pastor. They're actually for the congregation, right?
Yep.
Submission should not be for the pastor. Submission should be for the person. Okay, I think a lot of us have a misconstrued perspective and perception of submission. My pastor teaches it this way. We've watched too much WWE in America. And so we think that submission is strictly a chokehold.
Yeah.
And submission can be a nasty word.
Yep.
It's kind of like that, what's that D word? Discipline? It's just like, we don't like these words, right? But these words are actually good words. Let me try to redeem that word for some people. Submission is this picture here, is if I were in the rain and I had an umbrella to cover myself from the rain, if you were to submit under that umbrella, you're submitting to the covering.
Yeah.
You're not cowering. You're not kneeling. You're not less than.
Yeah.
You're not needing to be something that you're not. You're simply stepping under the umbrella.
Yeah.
You're simply stepping under the covering. And by stepping under the covering, you are now covered from the elements.
Yeah.
That's what submission is. Another way to put it is, if you are into cycling, right? I cycle from time to time. I am a triathlete. I did a half Ironman once. A little flex there.
All right.
And in cycling, there's this thing called the Peloton. There's a whole company named after it. There's this thing called the slipstream. And if you align yourself behind the person in front of you directly and follow that person's back wheel, you will face so much less resistance. And you can see in the Tour de France, you can see sometimes in these different cycling races that they'll form a peloton. Why? Because a team that forms a peloton, a team that comes into alignment, a team that has unity, can go further and faster than by trying to cycle on their own and facing the elements on their own.
Yeah.
And so submission, simply put, if it's healthy, is a God-given covering, is God-given protection in the form of leadership. God works in order. He works through leaders. And so, I mean, it's unfortunate if you've been in a situation where that language has been misappropriated and has been used by, manipulative tactics. Yeah. But that is not God's plan. God's plan, though, is submission. God's plan is authority. Yeah. And under godly authority and submission, there is incredible covering, protection, and provision. And you can go further and faster if you are willing to do that. Yeah.
So let's talk accountability, because in Matthew 18, it gives an example of going directly to the person. So if a pastor is being held accountable, very rarely would somebody see it, because someone's going directly to that person. It's not being said from stage, this is how we're holding X person accountable. How can we know that our pastor is submitting to accountability and actually has people holding him accountable in his life in the same way that it would be preached from stage that we all should have accountability as well?
Yeah. So this is kind of a question on church governance, right? And so, every church should have a board. Churches call it different things, right? Other churches might have more religious terms around eldership, which is a council of, and actually the Bible gives specific instruction on how an elder is meant to live above reproach. How an elder has specific things in their world that they need to have to qualify biblically to be an elder. I would apply those to, even if we wanted to use language of a board member, right? And so a pastor should be accountable to a board of directors. There's certain provisions, and actually there's a whole list of principles on the ECFA website that's really good, the Evangelical Financial Christian Accountability Board. And in there, they have certain principles like, the board shouldn't be constructed with all people that you're paying, right? That's a conflict of interest, because if they're paid by you, it's going to be harder to then have a fair kind of feedback loop in terms of what their real thoughts are, because maybe they think it's going to affect their salary, or it's going to affect, their earning potential within the church. And so there's things like that, right? The board can't just be made up of all your family, right? And there's things like that. Some of them might seem like common sense. Some of them maybe are just good things to refresh yourselves on. And so if a church is doing it right, they are communicating to the church periodically that there is a board, there is a governing structure, who that board is, so that the church knows that, okay, cool, this is not just, one person left to his or her own devices that's leading this thing, even though they are accountable ultimately to God. But we're being smart, and we are organizationally set up well with something like a board. At the same time, you got to understand that the Bible is very clear that God will hold pastors, leaders, ministers accountable at a greater level. And so I do think it does cross the line sometimes when members are over-concerned about this, because it's almost as if they're trying to take control in their own hands and they're not trusting God, right? If there's so many signals where and so many breaches where, you're not able to trust the church anymore, just find another church. There's over 300,000 churches in America. And so just find another church. I would actually say that that's likely not the most common situation, though. Most churches, and there's a lot of healthy churches there's a lot of healthy pastors out there. As long as they are submitting to their congregation that there is a governing structure, there is a board, there is an eldership that they submit themselves to, that should be a good indication that this is a solid place.
Yeah. So the word honor is used quite frequently in churches today.
Yeah, I love this topic.
But what is actually being done is idolatry and not honor.
Wow.
Or at least that is what it appears to be.
In some churches, for sure.
On the outset.
Definitely.
So what could be done to not cross the line? And what is the difference between honor and idolatry in a healthy way? Like, how does honor stay healthy without touting somebody as above everyone else?
I think actually more churches suffer from lack of honor within their church rather than too much.
Okay.
I think in culture, what we think is that there's an idolatry problem, but that's only because those churches that are exposed in that are in the media. Those are the ones that we hear about, right? Yeah. There's hundreds of thousands of other churches where that's not the case. I've actually been to dozens and dozens of churches at this point, and more common theme that I see is that there's a lack of honor. There's a lack of making sure there are armor bearers around the pastor. I'm a big proponent of honor because I believe that is how blessing flows to you as an individual when you have honor in your life. I believe that allows an atmosphere around you for blessing to flow through you And I believe that if you have honor in your life, it's a constant reminder that this is not about you.
Yeah.
And so, one way that you can have a healthy sense of honor is that at the very top, there is a constant reminder that the higher you go in leadership within a church organization, the greater servant you are. There should be a mentality that it's not just honor up, but it's honor down and it's honor all around.
Yeah.
And honor can be contextualized in a healthy way when you understand that it's not based on performance. So I'm not going to honor my pastor because he preached a good sermon. I'm going to honor my pastor because he's my pastor. That's actually the position I want to put him in my life. It's not the position that he needs to assert over my life. It's a position that I'm inviting him to be in my life. Okay, what does that mean?
Yeah.
I don't need a buddy's reward. I have a lot of friends. I don't need a friend's reward. I want a pastor's reward.
Yeah.
I only have one pastor, right? It's like saying, I'm only going to honor my wife because she took care of the kids today, or because she went to work today, or because she cleaned the house today.
So it's works-based.
Yeah, I'm not honoring Kim, my wife, based on her performance today.
Yeah.
I'm honoring her based on her position in my life.
Yeah.
I want her to be my wife, and I want a wife's reward. I want a spouse's reward.
Yeah.
Right? And so it's actually less about the pastor demanding it and more about the congregation getting a revelation around it.
Yeah.
Because we've talked about this in another episode, people's perception will dictate their reception. It's biblical.
Yeah.
When Jesus went to his hometown, they started gossiping about him. They said, hey, isn't that Mary's son? And literally, in that culture, you would refer to people from who their father was. And so just the fact that they were saying that, isn't that Mary's son, was already diminishing Jesus in their world. And this was his hometown. So people were just talking like that about Jesus.
Yeah.
And then he goes to say, after some of that chatter, he was shocked at their unbelief and he could do no miracles. No, Jesus can do miracles.
Yeah.
But their perception of, or I'll say this, what's the opposite of honor? It's not dishonor. It's familiarity. It's when you treat something as so familiar, right? And so I do think that the problem primarily in most churches that I've seen is there's a lack of honor. Those churches that are struggling with honor in a weird way, where it's become idolatry, I think that would probably be evident. I mean, people have common sense.
Yeah.
Like if you're following somebody that talks a lot about them and talks about them more than they're interested about you. I mean, there's so many telltale signs.
Yeah.
But I would just say that that's probably not the majority of pastors. I think actually the majority of pastors struggle with how to cultivate a culture of honor that's not just directed to them, but directed and propagated within the organization.
Yeah. A lot of churches, because they're on social media, have to care about a brand, a presence, and quite honestly, optics.
Yeah.
Which can leave a lot of people feeling like their emotions are being preyed on, to be crass.
Right.
So, for instance, you're in a church service and the photography team is in your face as you're literally bawling, worshiping.
Kind of like Joel today.
Kind
during
of.
our podcast recording.
Right, exactly. Why is that happening? Why are we so focused on optics that in the process it can detract from the experience that people are having in the room?
Because we live in a world where stories are being told through Instagram, right? And, you see this. Literally in Santa Clara here in the Bay Area, they renamed our whole city for 2 days to not Santa Clara, but Swifty Clara, because Taylor Swift came into town.
Oh my gosh.
And she packed out Levi Stadium where the 49ers don't even pack out the stadium. Taylor Swift packed it out for like 2-3 nights straight. It was ridiculous. Yeah. And people got FOMO because they saw the images and the videos and the highlights and the reels on social media the next day. And it, compelled them to purchase a ticket. We shouldn't be so naive to not leverage the tools and the tactics that the world has used to prop up a demigod in Taylor Swift. And this is nothing against Taylor Swift. I don't know her. She played a big part in Kim's college music listening career. And so I've had
Taylor Swift funded her college.
I've had a mixtape or two with a little bit of T-Swizzle on it. So I don't have anything against her. All I'm saying is that, the reason why the modern church, those that are seeing some growth, have adopted things such as lights and, tactics that elevate the music and sound systems that, give the sound a clarity and a tune and a tone that is engaging. Mm-hmm. And so that you don't need to necessarily hear your bad singing. And so it kind of drowns out and you can, really be in that worshipful experiences because it works. Yeah. And so digital storytelling, it works. Mm-hmm. Can capture teams and digital teams maybe do it more tactfully? Sure. Can maybe they understand if there is a new guest that, they've never seen this person before. So maybe like getting up in their face and taking a picture of them might freak them out because it's their first Sunday. Mm-hmm. Sure. But if it is a person you've seen every Sunday and they're on team and they're just having a moment in worship, I don't think that person that's having a moment in worship that's a member that's on team should get offended by maybe the capture team trying to capture that moment. Because at the end of the day, I actually don't believe in, and we as a church don't believe in the statement, okay, everybody close your eyes and it's just you and God. Because it's not. It's you and God when you're at home. Yeah. When you go to church, it's corporate worship, right? Mm-hmm. And so I also think that more of what we should capture is actually not just people sobbing, but people celebrating. A lot of church worship experiences nowadays feel like a funeral more than a wedding feast or a wedding party. And Jesus is alive, people. Yeah. He's not dead. We're not doing a funeral service. This is not a memorial. This is a resurrection party. Wow. And so I do think maybe what could be captured a little bit more and what people would probably be down for is maybe not their sobbing face on Instagram, but maybe their joyful face because they were partying during praise. Yeah.
Now, it recently came out in a variety of news sources about ridiculous levels of honorariums for church speakers or something like that.
I've seen this. I used to be a CFO of this church vibe. So I've seen these invoices.
So I want to talk about that next because you have a group of people who have left the church because we'll get to church hurt in a second, but you have another group of people that have left the church because they have said one thing and done another. And one of the things we talk about this on this podcast is do what you say you're going to do, but also don't take people anywhere that you haven't first been yourself. Mm-hmm. So when you have a church talking about doing stewardship or something, and then it's revealed later that they're giving ridiculous amounts of money for people to be speaking when there's other things that might be issues that need addressed financially. What would you say to people that are really upset about why was this person given this amount of money? And then, you have a youth pastor who can't even give the kids a pizza party, something like that.
Sure.
When there's misalignment, how would you address that?
Yeah, so the Bible is actually really clear, give honor where honor is due. There are specific verses that talk about ministers and pastors, that they're worthy of a double portion. And so I'm actually of the camp that we should be generous towards people that are preaching the gospel. We should be generous towards pastors and leaders. I'm of that camp. Okay. In saying that, I have seen the other side of the spectrum where, there was this musical artist that we wanted to get in for an event that we were doing, and the suggested honorarium or fee or however you want to call it was so large, it took my breath away. And I live in the Silicon Valley. I'm used to big numbers. It took my breath away. Wow. And like the writer, of like what was required, all that type of stuff. And I'm a person that skews towards give honor where honor is due. Let's be generous towards ministers. People were generous towards Paul, and he wrote about them. He said, man, this church was so generous towards me. And so I'm of that camp, but there has been times where I've had my breath taken away at some of the suggested honorariums and fees. I think what it comes down to is I'm not actually tied to a certain amount necessarily being unethical. I think I'm more inquisitive about the value for money, the return on investment question, right? And so maybe this person that I was engaging with that we were thinking about bringing into our church that was a musical artist, maybe that rate has been established because that is a good return on investment for certain churches, but it's just not for us.
Yeah.
Right? And so I do think that these rates are set because it's kind of like a market clearing price now. And I'm not afraid of that. I think people need to understand that there is this dynamic of supply and demand. And these rates are not because these people are necessarily trying to be unintegrous. These rates are because it's what they've gotten paid for by other organizations, ministries, and churches. I will say that if you go to the secular realm, if you go to the corporate realm, people are paying 6 figures, 7 figures for people to speak for a few hours, right? These are called keynote speakers and things like that. And so it's all kind of relative. I would say that, we should be slow to judge on, some of these topics.
Yeah.
And really take it contextually to, okay, what does our church need? What can our church benefit from? Are we lacking teaching around giving? Are we lacking teaching around evangelism?
Yeah.
Are we lacking teaching around outreach? Who's the subject matter expert? Who has God ordained? Who has God anointed to be able to speak into this? And are we in a phase, in a stage where we can invest into that minister to come in? And do we believe that minister carries the heart of our house, carries the culture of our house? And do all those things fit? If those things fit and somebody feels a type of way because it cost XYZ, then you should check your heart. Because if it was an investment into that person to bring something net new into the community so that the community can go forward, you got to trust your leaders are making that decision. Your leaders are not always going to get it right. Your leaders are not going to always do the perfect exact thing where every little dollar is literally maximized. There's going to be some growing pains. There's going to be some learning things. But I think you should trust your pastors. And if you don't trust your pastors and your leaders to make those decisions, you should reconsider that church.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? And so maybe that leads into some of the church hurt conversation. But a lot of times these things rub people the wrong way because they're harboring an offense that they have not yet addressed.
Sure.
Right.
Yeah. And that's why Proverbs speaks about it so much. So there's a lot of people out here that have, quote, church hurt, which if you think about for 2 seconds, you know that that's not the correct phrase for it. Nobody's just created a better way to explain what it is because someone hurt them or they're overworked, they're burnt out. Something went wrong. For some people, what they were doing in their life was addressed and that hit them sideways and offense was taken and then they left. It's a very broad spectrum.
Yeah.
But yet it's a prevalent feeling by many.
Yeah.
So what would you say to someone who currently, right now, has immense church hurt, so much so that they have given up on the church entirely?
Yeah, it's a bummer. I mean, the stats have been clear for the last couple of years that there is a decline of church attendance specifically. I'm a church optimist. I'm an optimist in general, but I'm especially a church optimist because it's the bride of Christ. Yeah. It's God's distribution plan for the gospel on this planet. That's not going to change.
Yeah.
80% of the Fortune 500 companies have turned over in the past 30 years, but the Church of Jesus Christ remains 2,000 years later. The church is resilient. The church has seen tough times. The church has seen great times. I would say we're in a season where it's seeing interesting times. And some of what those interesting or hard times are lending itself towards is a decline in church participation, especially from younger generations. And so that is something that we need to acknowledge. That is something that we need to address. And a good proportion of that, I would guess, is due to this umbrella conversation around church hurt, right? Ultimately, what I believe is that your relationship with God, hopefully, gets to a point of resilience to where one group of people or one entity cannot take you out from that. Romans 8:28 says, he works all things together for the good of those that are called according to his purpose. God saves, not based on anything that you did, but because he loves you so much. So if he's saved you, if he's called you, he will hold you, right? Yeah. He will preserve you, right? And I'm talking like, a fully reformed believer right now, but that's the fact. Yeah. And so when we read Romans 8:28, he works all things together for the good, we think about that just circumstantially in our life. Yeah. Let's make it really specific. If you went through an unfortunate church situation, can we believe that God can work it? Can we believe that God can redeem it? Yeah. Can we believe that God can use it to clarify, to deepen your conviction of maybe what a healthy church should look like, of what not to do, of maybe what to be wary of in the future? Absolutely he can. 100% he can. The bride of Christ is still being perfected. Yeah. You know why? Because he said he was going to come back for the church without blemish. Apparently there's still some blemishes because he ain't come back yet. And so we're still being perfected. Yeah. People are saved and they're still being saved. The church is being sanctified as a whole. And so what an opportunity. And, what I might be saying could be trite around, hey, what an opportunity to forgive, what an opportunity to not harbor offense. I know that's probably trite to people that could be hearing this that's literally in the midst of it and going through it. But don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Just because you had a bad experience at a restaurant doesn't mean that you have to stop eating, right? You got to keep feeding. You got to understand that God's plan is still to work through the local church, not you having a relationship with Jesus in isolation.
That's really powerful. Okay, I'd like to take off this hat now because that was hard to say serious the whole time. But this is a really serious topic. And for those of you that have experienced that in some degree, we just want to say that we're sorry that you had to go through that because nobody should. But unfortunately, we live in a broken world filled with broken people. And I think we can all say we have all been hurt in some respect within the church by someone in the church. And we also have all hurt someone in our lives and in the church. And so if we can take ownership, accountability, and responsibility for that, it levels the playing field to look at us to be more human with one another. Good. And I think that's really what this episode is all about, is seeing each other as humans and that we're so much better together.
Love that.